Welcome again to this episode of Unwound, where Stephen Watson has returned to speak to us about Emilio Pujol, who came up, featured quite prominently in our last conversation on no-nail guitar playing, particularly in the 20th century. But Pujol is such an important figure in the history of the guitar that I thought he would merit an episode dedicated to him alone. And there's no better person to come and talk about Pujol than Stephen Watson. Stephen is not long back from his travels. He was over in Lleida. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Lleida. Yeah.
Yeah. Not allowed to call it Lérida anymore, are
Absolutely not.
we?
No,
No.
no.
So anyway, Lleida, which is it's sort of the town nearest to the village where Pujol was born. It's in Catalonia, and so he's got lots to tell us about his trip. But firstly, Stephen, you've been doing some really interesting stuff online. Totally off topic, but interesting stuff with not not your normal classical guitar for a start. Some stuff on the Russian seven-string guitar, but then more recently some banjo. I mean, every variety of probably not every variety, but to my uneducated eyes, it seems like every variety of banjo. What drew you
Ah,
to the banjo?
well, I've before I played the banjo, which I just started this year, I wrote some compositions for banjo, which was for Rob MacKillop. And I think that was actually the first time we got in touch. It wasn't the no-nail thing, it was banjo. It was very odd. And I wrote some sort of quite modern pieces for him, which he played. And I didn't have a banjo at the time, but you know how these things sometimes creep up on you. And at the beginning of this year, I had the itch, and having got it, I realized, oh goodness, I'm going to have to get my hand on a banjo. And I went into London where there's a shop that sells historic banjos still, and I was trying them, and inevitably I walked out with one. And then I've become quite obsessed since. I should say the banjos I'm interested in are not like modern banjos at all. So they're gut strung usually. They're much more like a guitar in terms of the technique. And actually, it was contemporary with the guitar, and there was lots and lots of crossover. So many might be familiar with the banjo, mandolin, and guitar movement, which was hugely important at the time. And I'm quite interested in the way that studying the banjo can inform guitar playing, because there are sort of interesting ways in which the banjo was the supreme instrument for a time, and the guitar was sort of playing catch up and following its example. So I'm exploring that. And I'm also exploring the zither banjo, which is basically an English banjo, if such a thing seems possible. Although it was invented by an American, he came over with this very strange instrument, and it just took over the whole of the island. Well, I don't think it got to Scotland actually, but it took over all of England. And there are so many for sale. And it's a very strange instrument because it's a combination of wound, wire, and gut strings. Very peculiar sonority, a lot of sustain, and very suitable to a sort of Victorian sentimental music, which was quite popular. So yeah, and I mean, it sort of ties in with Pujol in a weird way, which is that Pujol actually grew up in a musical culture that where the guitar did often belong to a larger family of fretted instruments. You think, for example, of Miguel Labette's Lyra Orfeo, which was this fretted instrument orchestra, which was quite successful in its time and certainly sounds like it was a marvelous musical endeavor. And Pujol himself, before he really got into the guitar fully, played bandura, which is it's not quite a mandolin. It's a bit like a mandolin, but tuned in fourths and peculiar to Spain. And he played this on his brother's invitation because his brother had a fretted instrument band, and they actually went to the Paris World Fair to perform. Although it kind of all logistically and economically fell apart, and the father had to bail them out. But yeah, and then of course in the 20th century, the guitar became much more exclusive and wanted to extricate itself from these other instruments. And we had the formation of the classic guitar or the classical guitar. And Pujol was sort of born into this and was actually, in some ways, part of its formation alongside people like Segovia and Labette and Tarraga. Oh.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It, it ties in with what we were talking about last time, actually, in a way, which is
Mm.
that perhaps the guitar became, or guitar players became a little more tunnel visioned as the 20th century progressed. And as you mentioned, the banjo, mandolin, and guitar movement, the BMG,
Mm.
was the magazine that, I wouldn't quite say launched the careers of certain players, but certainly helped them very much.
Oh yeah,
I think Reem as a boy, I think featured on the cover of
yeah.
BMG. So
But back when he played without nails.
yes, that's right,
Yeah,
and he's playing some multi-string. I mean, well, every guitar's multi-string. It's got
yeah.
strings, but it's extra strung.
It's a Macaferri guitar,
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, yeah, and that it caused immense controversy because, there was this movement to define the classical guitar, and so the definition was kind of modelled on Segovia, but also on others. So six strings played with a certain technique, and the fact that Bream was playing this Macaferri monstrosity, as it was sometimes referred to, I think, was a source of great controversy. And Wilfred Appleby tried to cancel some of Bream's concerts because he refused to let this guitar be seen in public. It was really,
Really,
really strong.
interesting, very interesting. Anyway, so Pujol,
Wow.
just give us the rundown on his life.
Mm.
And firstly, actually, I mean, Pujol was not just a great player and a famous teacher. He was a major figure in the historical instrument movement, and also a very important historian for the guitar. His biography of Tariga, for example, is primary source
Mm.
material because he knew him and he studied with him. So he's such an important figure. Not mentioned all that much, I think, these days. I'm not sure he comes up all that much. I mean, maybe his, Etude, the Bees,
Oh
comes up
yeah,
a little bit, and maybe the three Spanish pieces to some extent. But other than that, he's just kind of seen as a slightly minor composer for the instrument. So just tell us about him. Tell us about his early life.
well, I think he lived a very long life, which is the
Yeah.
first thing to say, 94 years. And
Well, he was
until,
actually he was the same age as Segovia.
yeah, I was going to say,
Yeah, he was older than Segovia, but
Mm.
but he reached the same age as
Mm.
Segovia, which is
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Um, and having, well, the thing that's sort of cast a shadow, or maybe shadow is not the right word, but sort of informs his entire life and was almost a starting point for his life with his meeting with Tarago in 1902, age 16. Pujol describes it as providential, and he means that literally. To sort of give a sense of what Taraga means to Pujol. When Taraga came to stay with the Pujol family in their farmhouse, I think the day Taraga arrived, a tree started to grow, so the story goes. And for the rest of his life, Pujol maintained this tree and also gave leaves from the tree to students. And to this day, Hopkinson Smith, for example, the lutenist, still has a leaf from this tree.
Really?
There's a real, I mean, and also the very first meeting with Taraga, the first lesson, which Pujol describes in the biography of Taraga. Taraga told Pujol to file his nails.
Yeah.
He also did this with Josefina Robledo in her first lesson, told her to cut her nails. Slightly ambiguous what this means. It might not actually mean a complete cutting of nails. It might just mean a polishing. Probably means a complete cutting. But Pujol kept the nail file, Taraga's nail file, next to a portrait, sort of like a relic.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you should mention the word relic and and how Pujol saw his meeting with Taraga, because I find reading the biography, it's almost like reading the life of a saint.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's the tone of the whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lovely quote somewhere where Pujol says to a student, "Oh, to stray from Taraga is to stray from the truth." That's quite a statement. I mean, and also it's a sign of the times because can you imagine someone saying today to stray from David Russell is to stray from the truth? I mean, I love David Russell's music, but it's a very different. And I'm not being disparaging of it. I'm not sort of laughing at him because I find it quite beautiful, and I think that kind of biography has a place, and it doesn't tell you much about the historical Taraga maybe, but it does tell you something about the meaning of Taraga's life to his students. and something about the broader sort of aesthetic culture in the air.
Yes, and I think it allows the reader to immerse himself in that outlook,
Mm.
almost to to see Tariga's life through a historical lens, if you like, not an historical lens in the sense of putting fact after fact, but just absorbing that way of seeing things.
Mm.
You know, it's
Yeah, I agree.
yeah.
Um, uh, what was I saying? Taraga and Pujol. I think Pujol. It's hard to know how close Pujol was actually to Taraga, because it's all a bit. The history's a bit murky and mythological, and I sort of get by Pujol's writings, as you say, this saint-like approach to Taraga implies a certain distance actually, and it's not like with Lebet and Daniel Fortea where there seems to be more of a friendship. I think for Pujol it was very much student master. And I've not sort of seen personal correspondence between Pujol and Taraga, for example. Um, and it's not clear, he obviously knew Taraga well and studied with him well. But I think sometimes people approach Pujol's writings and sort of backward engineer onto Taraga. Oh, that's how Taraga played, or that's how Taraga approached music. And I think no, Pujol was very much his own player. And his method is not following the principles of Taraga; it's based on the principles of Taraga. There's a sort of outflowing
Yeah.
from it. And
It's worth also emphasizing that you know that Pujol came into contact with Tariga during Tariga's last decade.
yes,
And there's a big age gap between them. There's a 34-year age gap, I think, between
sounds right. Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
yeah, or something like that. And uh, Tariga, I mean, it's well into his final decade. He only had 7 years left, I think,
mm,
when Pujol met him. And I mean, okay, I think there's only about 8 years maybe between Pujol and Jobet, but perhaps Jobet just being that bit older,
mm,
and that he was in contact with Tariga whilst Tariga was still very much in the middle of his career,
mm,
and
yeah,
I think that
yeah,
would make it that would probably there'd be a difference in relationship,
yes,
very much the old man and a boy really with Tariga and Pujol.
absolutely. And of course, Taraga was ill for a lot of those final years,
Yes,
sort of on
yeah,
and off. So that does create also a kind of detachment.
yeah,
Whereas with Miguel Lebet, there was a lot of collaboration,
yeah,
duets, and also you can see them sort of feeding off each other's transcriptions of music and
yeah.
inspiring each other. No, it's different with Pujol.
Yeah,
But
and also sharing patrons or sort of patrons perhaps.
ah,
There's that basically they were both running their careers simultaneously, even though one was older than the
yes,
other. And of course, that's not the case really with Tariga and Pujol.
yes, yes, and I think Lebet in the beginning, or at that point, was less of an imitator of Taraga and more his own player.
Mhm.
Whereas I think Pujol for a while, certainly until Tarraga's death, was
Yeah,
very much an imitator.
yeah,
This is not a criticism. I mean, we all do it. Um, and I was probably imitating Brie most of all. And
yeah,
but I
maybe.
now sound nothing like Brie. Not that I did ever, but yeah. But nevertheless, it was very, very useful for someone to be a student of Tarraga. And this can't be overstated. That probably your best PR as a guitarist, and not just in Spain, was to advertise yourself as a student of Tarraga
Yeah,
because his students have been very successful in this sort of apostolic way of going around and spreading the mythology of Taraga literally across continents. And so the name Taraga had this potent force to it, which really helped launch Pujol early on. And I think this is the aspect of Pujol that gets most neglected, which is Pujol the performer. Because from about 1911, let's say, when he first started to have professional concerts, to 1939, when really he stopped, he was in the top rank of guitarists. It's very hard to sort of rank guitarists, especially when we have so little oral data. Um, he was probably a bit shy of Lebet and Segovia, not quite their equal. I think in his personal writings, he sort of felt conscious of having to keep up with them, I think, and sort of having to practice a lot. I don't think it maybe came quite as naturally to him. But certainly in terms of his importance, he was ranked beside them often.
But did he start playing later? I mean, he was 16 by the time he met
Yeah,
Tarek. And his father wasn't keen on him pursuing the guitar until
yes,
hearing Tarika, according to the Pujol biography of Tarika, of course.
yeah,
But did he perhaps start playing later, or start taking it
yeah,
seriously later? Or,
yeah. It doesn't seem like he took it seriously until age 16. And
yeah.
of course, if it's clearly implied that he played without nails before then, so he would have converted to nails after then, which creates another sort of complication of
Mm.
reinventing yourself. When did Lebet start playing? I've never actually thought about that.
So he played with nails before.
Oh yeah, tell Pujol did. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh well,
he played with nails before meeting Tarika.
did I say the opposite?
Yeah, I think
Oh,
you said
sorry.
it.
I played,
I think,
yeah, he played
yeah,
with nails. Yeah, yeah,
he played with Nails, and then at the age of
yeah.
16, yeah. I mean, it's just that one thing I've observed, partly myself as well, because I was borderline, really, when not quite a young player, not quite a late starter, when I got going, but I think you can see the difference between Bream and Williams. Williams was an early starter, was very well
Mm,
taught from a very young age, and of course he has that magnificent, perfect looking technique, and you're still able to play very, very accurately and well into old age.
mm,
Whereas Bream had that technique that is just almost painful to look at, and he didn't have the benefits of a Len Williams making sure that he placed his fingers in exactly the right way. He really had to do it himself
mm.
and got going later. But I found, in teaching children that there's an age at which the hands become less kind of squishy, basically. They're quite sort of malleable at an early age, and they start to stiffen. Basically, when you get to double digits, but
Mm,
10, they start to get
mm.
a bit stiffer.
Yeah,
And I think if you haven't really got going with your technique before the age of 10, I think a lot of players do find that they have to keep on top of it
yeah,
through their whole life. Where people who had it kind of sorted before the age of 10, like John Williams,
yeah,
probably never had to think that much about technique.
yeah,
He just kind of had it from an
yeah,
early age. It was as second nature to him as walking or talking. So, yeah.
yeah. Absolutely. I hadn't thought about that with relation to Pujol. Yeah, it certainly applies to me first. I mean, I came to the classical guitar basically as an adult.
Yeah.
So certainly the right hand is very strange to me, and I keep reconfiguring my right hand, which creates problems. Which is why I sympathise with Pujol having to sort of convert when meeting Tarraga. Um, yeah, and obviously when Pujol stopped playing, it seemed to deteriorate quite fast, and perhaps not just on account of health difficulties. So we have this unfortunate situation, where we have a few recordings from the 1930s, which are good, and then we have the sort of home recordings which are not good from the 50s. And it's sort of, I mean, if we take the Bream comparison again, it's like if we only had a few Bream recordings from the 1980s, and then nothing until the sort of 2010, long after he'd retired and was losing his technique. That's kind of where we're at with Pujol.
Yeah.
So it's very hard retrospectively to assess him as a player.
Yeah.
I can tell you all about the wonderful reviews he had and how well he was regarded, but without oral evidence, it's very difficult. But tantalizingly, in the archive, there are more recordings. And I couldn't hear them annoyingly because they're being restored. But it looks like we've got some 1930s recordings done by the Gramophone Company of Pujol and his wife playing some Granados, which is probably the intermezzo, and also Pujol playing some Tarraga and Saw. I don't know what pieces. So hopefully, if they can get them restored and digitized, which they said they're going to do by the end of the year, we could be in for a very interesting historical discovery.
Oh, right. That's something to look out for.
Uh,
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear him.
Hmm.
If not in his prime, at least kind of slightly
Get the
closer
sense.
to his prime than
Yeah.
we have available to
Yeah.
us now. So yeah.
And I
So
mean, I was going to say the other interesting thing is that okay, he was doing lots of solo performing, and he, as we said before, he was the first person to play the Wigmore Hall. He was playing in Paris a lot, in Germany and Spain and South America, very active. But he wasn't just a soloist, and this is kind of unusual for the time. He was playing lots of duo stuff with his wife, of course.
yeah.
And actually, by all accounts, they really received rave reviews. The absolute most enthusiasm he would get before the duo playing. It's sort of a prefiguring of the Presti Lagoya duo. But I think actually, um, in some ways, Pujol and his wife were more evenly matched, I think. And they also had more contrast between them in that it's a it's a it's a relationship I wish I could do more research into, but I'm just not sure where to start. But
Give us the
they didn't.
rundown because she's such
Yeah,
an
yeah,
important figure in his life, an important
exactly.
figure in her own right, important for the guitar. And
I
again,
mean,
most people haven't heard of her. So just tell
no.
us about her, who she is.
Mathilde Cuevas. She first saw Pujol apparently in a concert and didn't and liked the look of him, but was annoyed that he didn't take any notice of her in the audience and decided from then on she didn't like him. And then years later, they somehow met again in Paris, and she decided, oh no, I actually quite like him. Interestingly, they were quite old at this point. They were, I think he was 37 when they met, and she was 44. So quite an unusual age gap for the time. And they were quite different temperaments because he was this sort of no-nail guitarist, student of Tarragon, who prized the guitar for its sort of introverted qualities. And had all sorts of theories about nails and no nails and how the guitar is either homogeneous or heterogeneous or introverted or extroverted or it's orchestral or it's like a string quartet. And in his writings, you would think, oh, he doesn't much like the sort of more flamboyant way of playing. And yet his wife was a nail player who played flamenco and played it very well and very flamboyantly. And then you have this unlikely combination between the two. And I think it created a sort of electric, magical quality that you can hear in those two recordings we have of The Fire, where they're really playing off each other beautifully. And they're very different, but very evenly matched. And yeah, I mean, just the reviews are lovely. Everyone so loved the sound they made as a duo.
And the ensemble's very good, despite the huge
Yeah,
contrast in style and temperament. The
yeah,
ensemble is very fine, which was what was lacking in the Bream Williams
mm,
sort of duo
mm.
stuff, I think. I mean, they were very different players, but I think they just had such a different approach to where the beat was, basically. That
Yes,
that
yes.
well, it was the old John Jewart joke, but that they had that they made the first album was together, the second album was together again, the next one might be together at last.
Oh, I didn't know. I didn't know that. Oh, that's marvelous.
Anyway, just for the record, I love Bream and Williams,
Yeah,
absolutely, and actually, I love the Together albums as well,
yeah, so do
especially
I.
very influential albums. But yeah, on, they sound like two soloists almost battling sometimes,
Ah,
which
yes,
and
yes.
that's not the case
No.
with Pujol.
Well, I think it's partly because Pujol was a soloist, but he also wasn't. And as I said, this is very unusual for the time because, the chief ambition of most concert guitarists, or every concert guitarist at that time, was to be a performer first and foremost, and
Yeah,
everything else was sort of secondary and
yeah,
supplementary. But for Pujol, that wasn't the case. I mean, he was doing the duo stuff, he was playing with singers, so he was playing an accompaniment role, very unusual. He was also playing, did some stuff with string quartets. He did some new music, chamber music, two guitars, flute, and voice. Actually putting himself in the back seat. And and he had this. Well, I think this is what makes him so remarkable to me. And you touched on it earlier, is that he sought to be so many things. He sought breadth, and he did it without any sort of shallowness. He was a top tier performer. He was not just a sort of top tier guitar researcher, but pioneering. I mean, there's
yes,
really nothing so good as what he had produced before him. And it's not just the Tarragon biography, it's not
no,
just the method, which is no, there's still no guitar method with the breadth that his has.
mhm.
There's also, he wrote a history of the guitar in 1926 for an important French encyclopedia, which is really good for its time. The history of the nail question, the first person to tackle it. Um, Pioneering editions of Vihuela music,
Yeah,
and the first person to actually resurrect the Vihuela,
yeah,
and
that's right.
in
Yeah, it's
1936.
Simplicio made
Yeah, yeah.
the
Yeah,
instrument.
yeah, exactly. I think I've heard accounts from his students who I've talked to who say that it was a terrible instrument, and I can well believe it because I think Pujol sort of went to a museum and took all these measurements and then told Simplicio, "Here's my measurements, build it for me."
Yeah.
I think it's sort of so. I don't think it was a faithful reproduction. I
No,
could be
no,
wrong.
no. It doesn't look
Yeah.
it from the picture.
No, no. But nevertheless, it's really modern-minded in a way. It's
Yeah.
called pioneering early music, and then also he was a really good composer. And I think this gets lost because he wrote so much pedagogical material, and it's sort of like with Caruli, he wrote so much that you sort of miss the gems in amongst it all. But there are at least a handful of works by Pujol which are just amazingly good, I think, for a
Yeah, I
guitarist
agree.
composer of the time.
I
Um,
agree. Harmonically, he's one of the most adventurous
oh, absolutely.
of the guitarists at the time.
Mm,
Yeah, no question. And he was absorbing a lot of the French music of the
yes.
time. Lots of impressionistic harmonies, whole
Yeah,
tone
yeah.
scales in there. Yeah. No, I would just encourage people to look into Pujol. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would just name check a couple of pieces. Obviously, the three Spanish pieces are marvelous, but the Endecha he wrote for the death of his wife,
Oh, yeah.
amazing.
It's a
Which
miniature masterpiece. Yeah.
it is, and only one person's recorded it, Rob MacKillop.
Yeah,
No
that's
one
right.
else has touched it.
Mhm.
It's just amazing.
Yeah.
And you got like the homage to Scarlatti, which is study number 6,
Yeah.
an astonishing piece. Invocation, a gorgeous little chorale. There's so many gems, and even in the method, if you go through it, you will find some studies that are just
Yeah,
beautifully
they're
done.
great. They're great. They're
Yeah.
great pieces, and they're great musical studies as well. Just
Mm,
as Soars were actually
yes.
before. Really good just for studying phrasing and things. But obviously, an entirely different era, different language, and they're great technical workouts. They really
Yeah.
are.
Oh, absolutely.
If you want to do books 3 and 4 studies,
Yeah, yeah,
serious stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it also relates to the fact that Pujol was very involved in the production, premiering, publishing of new music. And I guess people tend to remember, if they remember Pujol, they remember the Vihuela stuff
Mhm.
and, the sort of transcriptions of Debussy and so on. But also in the, Max Eschig was publishing the Bibliothèque de musique ancienne et moderne pour guitare, which was Pujol's great big library from 1927 till his death in 1980
Yeah.
of all his transcriptions of old music and then his editions of new music,
Mhm.
including stuff by composers like Fire and Rodrigo and Halfter, and then very obscure composers now forgotten, but for whom Pujol was premiering their music.
Mhm.
And some of that stuff is amazing. I mean, it's just, I mean, there's one recording of it by Victor Landiera, but otherwise just neglected. There's in the 1920s, Alfonso Brockwer, who was a Uruguayan composer, wrote this monumental 7 movement Evocaciones Criollas for Pujol, which is so different to anything else in the repertoire at the time. I mean, Pujol regarded it as like Faya's Homenaje, a sort of a starting point for the instrument. I tend to agree, actually. I don't think it's exaggeration. And it's interesting the kinds of things Pujol was premiering. If you contrast it to, say, Segovia and Sainz de la Maza, who were the 2 other guitarists who were doing a lot of new music, Segovia is quite neoclassical, I would say. I don't think you'd say that's fair. Um, and Reginald Sainz de la Maza, sometimes it's called avant-garde music. I don't think we'd call it that today, but quite rhythmic, um, quite modernist in a way. Pujol's is very impressionistic, and it's actually the most impressionistic repertoire we have. Um, Also, another marvelous one is Auguste Grau's Fable, which is an imaginary tragedy about 2 weasels, 10-minute long single movement work. It's I mean, its closest parallel will be the Cyril Scott Sonatina, but it's better than that, I think.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so it's just when you get into Pujol and studying Pujol, you just find this sort of periphery of gems and interesting things that are just waiting to be discovered.
Well, there are so many uh, things you've said uh, so far that for the listener, listeners, you need to pause the video and make a note of these things. In fact, maybe I'll get you to send over some
Sure, yeah,
stuff
yeah.
that we can link because there's so much there that you've listed.
Hmm.
Yeah, what an amazing figure. So yeah, I mean, just to summarize what you said already, we've got well, it's what we said at the start, but you filled in the details, which is that a great performer,
Hmm.
a great uh, chamber performer as well, Joe with his wife, his flamenco guitarist wife,
Hmm.
uh, a great historian, publisher of new music,
Yeah.
performer of new music. I mean,
Yes.
a
Composer
historical
and teacher. Don't be
teacher,
yeah,
an early pioneer of historical performance practice.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, it's quite incredible, really.
Yes. And I think it's kind of he was maybe in the wrong time for doing that because it was the time of the soloist and the concert performer,
Yeah.
which I don't think he was naturally at home at. He did well in it, but some accounts say, he was. he was at its best like Tarraga in a sort of intimate situation
Yeah.
among friends, followers, colleagues, so on. But now I think we seem clearly to be entering an era where guitarists are doing a lot more research. They're doing a lot more composing. There's a kind of breadth which is born partly out of necessity, but also just out of a broadening of interests. And Pujol was very critical in his time of what he called the fanatical guitarist, which was very much a phenomenon. They're the sort of guitarist for whom there was nothing but the guitar. All of the musical universe is condensed into the guitar, and they study the guitar first and foremost. And if they have any time left over, they might study a bit of music. Whereas for Pujol, music came first, the guitar second. And you see this when you talk to students who are alive when he did his annual courses. And I mean, he died in 1980, so there are still people around who remember him, and I've tried my best to talk to many of them. And the way he taught was quite holistic. Would that be the right word? He would say, if I ask a student, what do they know of Dante? What do they know of Cervantes? What do they know of their life, of their surroundings? And I can tell by their answer whether they're a good guitarist or not. And he would, I think it would take students for walks. Like he would convince that this would be a part of their education.
Yeah.
It was a broad approach that I find quite lovely and in a way quite modern.
Yeah. 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 Similar to what Arthur Rubinstein used to say when asked how much he practiced. And
Ah,
he would often say that he actually didn't practice very much. I mean, compared to a lot of pianists. And for him, living life
mm,
was part of his his artistry.
mm,
A love of life, and that did not just mean um, you know, kind of empty pleasure seeking.
yes,
He enjoyed high society as well, but it meant literature, it meant
yeah,
culture, it meant
yeah,
a broad range of interests, and that all fed into his 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 piano playing and the way he interpreted music. And people said when they heard Rubinstein that you would leave the concert hall with a spring in your step. He
mm,
played in that way, and I think it's interesting that that's the case. Anyway,
yeah,
similar, just as an
absolutely,
analogy, throw him in as a pianistic analogy, a
yeah,
piano
absolutely,
analogy to Pujol.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
What did you learn
Oh,
in Lleida that was uh, new for
um,
you?
oh, what would be of interest? I mean, a lot when you do research, a lot of what you find is not obviously revelatory. It's the sort of little details that fill things in or slightly change your perspective.
Mhm.
I would say what was quite interesting was going through the correspondence between Pujol and his agents in Britain, because for me as a British guitarist, sort of starting to see how important Pujol was for the guitar in London in particular. I mean, from 1912 to 1939, he was a continual presence. He was performing in concert halls. He was on BBC Radio many times.
Hmm.
And there are some counts of people remembering these performances as being influential on them. And there was one tantalizing reference in a letter that he was on BBC television in 1939. And, that excites me quite a bit because
Yeah,
television was a very new medium.
yeah.
And for him to have been invited on to play again with his wife, it's quite something.
And you said 1939.
1939, yeah.
Yeah, well, not all that many people would have seen it, of course.
No, not all that many people
Only
would have
about
seen
two
it.
people had it.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Well, I think television had been around for about 3 years then, but yeah, the
yeah,
numbers who had
yeah,
it were extremely low.
yeah.
And
But
then
still,
television,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. Still, it sort of testifies to his standing, I think, and respect that he had
yeah.
um, at the time.
Yeah. And as you pointed
Well,
out in the last interview, he was the first guitarist to play at the Wigmore Hall,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and it was still the Bechstein Hall.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. And he came back to play there again in 1928 and various other halls. Um, what else? Lots of letters are interesting. Sort of trying to fill in the gaps. Letters from Smith Brindle to Pujol were useful. Um, uh, his correspondence with Segovia, of course. I can't miss that. And actually, I mean, our last conversation, as you reflected on it, I reflected on it and felt my comments were somewhat intemperate, only somewhat. Um,
Yeah. Well, it's a
But
free-flowing conversation. I think
yes,
people have to understand that the
exactly.
nature of these things, that we're not making highly polished,
No,
documentaries here. The idea is that it's a free-flowing conversation that you can take part in. So we're sometimes going to express
yeah.
ourselves in ways that
And it's also, of course, with me, I come at it always from a particular perspective, which
yeah,
tends to be the no-now research. But reading the letters was actually quite lovely. I had quite a nice opinion of Segovia afterwards. And it's sort of strange. It's like how people can often be rather nasty in public, but not in private. It's the sort of social media effect.
yes, I was
And
just about to say, yeah,
I think that might apply in this case, in that in the letters, Segovia is lovely to Pujol. I mean, their relationship went on for about 70 years. I mean, from 1910 or so onwards, when
yeah,
Pujol first introduced Segovia into Madrid society, introduced him to Lebet, to Ramirez, got him concerts, gave him archival material. And then they had a sort of a friendship on and off. And they also had what Pujol describes as an anti-friendship on and off. But, actually, but Pujol is, in his private writings, quite sort of melancholy about some of this and does describe himself as having anti-friends, many powerful, which he's always so genial in public that it's strange to read that contradiction.
mhm,
But anyway, on the Segovia thing, in the letters, Segovia is saying to Pujol, I'm really interested in your compositions. I love your compositions. And he specifies which compositions he's going to learn. He says, I'm going to record them. He says, I'm going to help you get royalties. He says, I'm going to help you get more works published with Shot. He says, I'm going to introduce you to all these people. He's actually, I think he's genuinely trying to be very helpful. And he's acknowledging his debts to Pujol
yeah,
in a way that he doesn't in public. And that's kind of infuriating. But at least
yes,
it's nice to see
mm,
that there were points at which they really did have a mutual respect. And I would like to fill in the gaps as to why they kept falling out. I think it was more Segovia's proclivity for saying injudicious things in public. Um, but yeah, oh, I mean, the other thing, filling in the gaps in the archive, bits about Pujol's illness. This has always interested me because we have this gap between the recordings and they're so contradictory in terms of quality. And there was some references to some serious illness in 1950, which for me sort of confirms that those later recordings aren't representative of his playing.
yeah,
So things like that help.
yeah. Worth pointing out that in 1950 he was 64.
Yeah, and it's an age for a lot
You
of
know,
people. And of course, he lived through some awful situations. I didn't realize till reading some of these documents, with, one with his student, that he was in France as the Germans came and occupied, and they occupied the area he was in. Yeah, the man lived through some incredible historical moments.
yeah, of course he did. You know, and how did he manage the Spanish Civil War?
Oh, he just wasn't there. He was in Paris.
He was in Paris, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like the
He
usual.
was in Paris, but having the Germans.
Yeah, the Germans. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of interesting how not oblivious, but he thought he was in Paris, and then he thought, oh, war may be coming, but we'll move to a more remote part of France, and the Germans won't go anywhere near. And of course, a week later, the Germans were
Yeah.
there. You know, it's
Yeah.
interesting documents.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing he didn't show up in old, "Hello, Hello" episodes. um, yeah, yeah, but yeah. Okay, that's good stuff. So yeah, I would encourage everybody to check out Stephen's social media accounts and follow him Facebook, Instagram. You've got YouTube
Yeah.
as well, and as well as the recent banjo videos
Wow.
but Stephen does put stuff up about his research and there are some great photos from your trip trip to Spain
Yeah.
and where is it again that you were able to access the archives?
Oh God, everything's in Catalan. I'm not very good at that. The Institut de Estudis Llerencs. I can give you a link to give to
Yeah,
people.
we'll put a
Uh,
link. I mean,
um,
I did actually know where it was. It's just I wanted you to.
yeah,
I did
but
want
yeah,
to put you on the
I
spot
can't.
pronouncing it rather than
No,
me.
it's a bit of a headache. Catalan
Yeah, yeah,
stuff, but
yeah,
yeah, I mean, it's completely open. Anyone who wants to access it,
yeah.
if you can get digitized copies. I mean, the reason I went was because I couldn't. I wanted to see thousands of documents, and so digitization became completely impractical. It's it's geographically quite inaccessible, which is annoying. I mean, Pujol donated his material to the city, and they've now put it outside the city, which is quite infuriating. But yeah, if you want to find out about it, I'll give you a link and you can contact them. And they've got a catalogue, beautifully. Everything is catalogued, very easy to find. Well worth it. I should say the other thing I did on my trip, which was fortuitous, was to meet up with Carlos Trepat.
Yeah, I was just about to ask about that.
Yeah, it was a very last minute trip, but it just so happened that Carlos was in the city at the same time as me. And Carlos is so interesting, not just because I admire him so much as a player. I find him the sort of the path he's on and the ideals he has, just because he holds them so strongly and it's so clear in what he's trying to achieve. I find that so admirable, and he changes so much and has changed so much. But also, he is a rare link to the Pujol world in that he grew up in Lleida. He was at the very last course Pujol put on in 1976. And he is now, in the way that lots of people do at some point in their life, he's gone back to his beginnings, and he's becoming more. Well, he's finding himself more involved in a sort of historical, imaginative process of rediscovering the Pujol school. So he's now playing without nails. He's been playing a Torres guitar for a long time, playing gut strings. I mean, his historical interest is wonderfully extreme because I mean, people know often that he has some gut strings at 100 years old, for
Yes.
example. And I asked him about this because I couldn't believe it. And they really are 100 years old. He found them in a box, Parastro strings. And he said because they had been used rather than unused, they actually had some elasticity. So they were fine to put on. And he put them on, and well, I think it was a very emotional experience. And he felt like he'd been looking for this sound, and he'd had it, and he's still got the strings, and he can still use them for very short periods at a time. If you watch the concert he did at the Teatro Colón, I think it's called,
Yeah.
he is using the third string and the fifth string are both 100 years old. You could see that and get an idea of it. But yeah, so that's very interesting. And I was very charmed by his description of his first meeting with Pujol, which was in 1975. And he'd never met Pujol before. Um, Pujol had been sort of in the city. Pujol had a presence there, and he'd seen him in a crowd a couple of times, but never met him. So he and a friend decided they were going to go to his house, just knock on the door. The trouble with doing that is that it was 33 kilometers away in the middle of nowhere along a dirt track, and they didn't drive. So they got on their bikes and they drove to Pujol's, not drove, they cycled to Pujol's house. Second complication, and it tells you something about Pujol's life, he had no electricity. He throughout his life, he sort of describes his existence as a bit monastic. And I think he may have been exaggerating, but there's something there. No telephone, no electricity. And so, they had to just knock on the door and hello. And I think Carlos, being a bit more reserved, didn't say anything, but the other friend is, we'd like to see Pujol. And this second wife, naturally very reluctant. I think the second wife, Maria, was quite a character, very strong,
Yeah.
contrast to Pujol. But no, Pujol came along, then would have been, what, God, nearly 90 years old,
Yeah. Yeah.
and admitted them and said, oh, come in, gave them a guitar, let them play, and as is Pujol's way, always so generous,
Yeah.
all as willing to teach and help a wonderful guitarist, like he taught John Williams or Alberto Ponce or Hopkins Smith, or all sorts of people came from his doors. John Taylor, Brian Jeffrey, but also equally willing to help the absolute amateur. A lovely generosity, and never sort of berated anyone, never got angry, as far as I can tell. Only times he would get angry is if someone insulted Tarraga. That's the sort of
Yeah.
to stray from Tarraga is to stray from the truth.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
It's a limit. But yeah, I love that description of Carlos going up like that, and it just, there's always a sense of withdrawal with Pujol. As I say, like Tarraga, I don't think the concert life came naturally to him. I think always he was trying to withdraw. And when he returned to Paris after the war, he was fed up with it. He said it's poisoned by greed and positivism. And then he went back to Spain. It's always withdrawing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sounds good. Sounds good. I like him. The more you talk about him, the more I like him.
yeah. So do I.
If we could just end, if you were to
Mm.
give people who are totally new
Ooh.
to him, where should they start? If you could recommend maybe
Mm.
one book to read, maybe
Um,
one thing to, one thing to listen to, one piece
mm.
of music to explore, you know, what would it be?
Book would be difficult because there's nothing in English. Um,
Yeah,
if you happen to read Catalan, there is a marvelous book by Maria Ribera, who has written really the only good biography of Pujol. If you don't, well, you can nowadays you can use Translate very easily, and
yeah,
you can read her thesis for free online.
yeah.
So
Okay.
if you
Oh
want
well.
details, that I can give you a link to that. Recordings, listen to the duo recordings of Pujol and his wife. There's two of them. Um, they're on one of the Segovia and his contemporary CDs.
Yes,
I
that's
can
right.
I can tell
Yeah,
you which one. I can't remember
you
off the
can
top of
get
my
those
head.
very easily. Find them on Spotify.
I think compositions. I think the indecha. I think more guitarists should look at the
Yeah,
indecha, because and I think not just sort of virtuosi guitarists they should be looking at too, but also actually intermediate guitarists could have a crack at it. I think maybe one of the reasons people don't is because it's in G sharp minor.
yeah. I think so. I think so. You
Puts
get all
people
those,
off.
yeah,
Yeah,
all those F double sharps.
yeah, exactly. Beginning on this
Leading
augmented chord.
note.
Yeah, yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
no, that's a beautiful piece. Well, look, Stephen, thanks again for coming on, for joining us. It was really good. Again, I think what comes across is just how likable he is as a character. I think you communicate that very well.
Hmm.
A very, very attractive figure, as well as being a very, very important one.
Hmm.
And in history, do you know, so often the the so-called great men of history are not always the ones you necessarily want to have a drink with
Hmm.
or sit down and spend. But he's one that seems to fit into both camps. He has a great historical
Hmm.
importance, but he is simpatico as well.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I mean, I suppose he didn't maybe view himself that way. It's the interesting thing. Is
Yeah,
he
that's why
Yeah,
you could. That's
yeah,
why you
yeah.
get
I think that
along with
is
him.
why actually very self-deprecating. When he would teach people, he would, if they were learning a piece of his music, he would say, "Why are you learning the music by this bad composer?" Or things like that. Or so tell students that he's his own worst pupil. It's very different to his contemporaries.
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay, great. Well, we're going to continue for a little bit with some questions from those who subscribe on Patreon. But for now, until next time, all the best.